A couple weeks ago, I posted this position from one of my recent Blitz games and challenged my Twitter followers to find the solution as if it was a puzzle. Now, black is down 7 points of material in this position, but if we look for forcing moves, we can actually find a checkmate in 4. Now, if you'd like, you can pause the video and try to find the solution for yourself, but we're actually going to come back to this position at the end after we've talked about what a forcing move is and all the other terminology that goes along with that. So a forcing move consists of 3 things: checks, captures, and threats. In most of your games, and in most of my games, this comes in the form of checks. If you make it a habit to, on every single move, look for the checks that you have with your pieces, that will win you a lot of games because it forces the opponent to do something right away, and that's what a forcing move is. Now, looking for checks is mostly what we're going to be talking about today, but to quickly cover captures and threats, if your opponent captures a piece, most of the time you want to capture that material back, right? And same with threats. If your opponent is making a threat of, for example, checkmate, you probably want to respond to that threat so you don't lose the game. And the same thing on the offensive side. If you capture one of your opponent's pieces, chances are they're going to capture back an equal amount of material. If you threaten some kind of checkmate, or if you're threatening material, they're going to defend their material or they're going to defend against checkmate. But this isn't always the case. Sometimes if your opponent captures some of your material, you don't have to capture back on that same square right away, or you don't have to capture back an equal amount of material right away if you have a bigger threat. And often that comes in the form of threatening checkmate or even just giving a check. In this position, our knight is under attack from this pawn, and so immediately a lot of players might be tempted to move that knight and save the material, but this is a blitz game that I played, and it was not a very good game. I'm clearly down an exchange. I have a knight in exchange for a rook, plus my king is out in the middle of nowhere. It's on g4, and so if I don't do something quickly in an attempt to find a checkmate on my opponent's king, I'm probably going to get checkmated myself. So in this position, if we're looking for our checks, we can actually move the knight and give this check. The problem is the queen will take it. We do have some miracle draw by just going back and forth between these two squares for a while, but that's probably not something I would want to go into, especially in a blitz game where I only have a few seconds to calculate whether that all works. I would rather not be down an entire rook. And that's a good thing because there's actually something much better in this position. Usually, especially with your queen, you want to get as close to the enemy king as possible. So if we're considering all of our checks, we have this check, we have this check, and we have this check. Obviously, this one is getting really close to the enemy king, and in fact, if we go here, the king only has 1 move. And now all of a sudden, black is on the defensive because we can give another check, force the king back up, and now the winning move here is actually to move the knight and give this check. There's nowhere for the king to move. It just can't move at all, and so the queen actually has to take the knight, sacrifice itself, and now this should be a pretty easy game to win. In the game, again, it's blitz, and so I only had a few seconds to come up with this decision. I instead decided to just leave my knight hanging, which is also a fine move. It's not, checkmate in 11, but I actually just pushed this pawn, threatening mate by promotion on the next move. Black can defend by going here, but instead my opponent, with 19 seconds on the clock, gave this check. I moved my king. They forgot about this threat and instead captured the knight, and then I promoted with checkmate. So it all worked out in the end, but going back, I think this probably would have been just a much easier move to play, just giving the check, and it's very clear that the king has nowhere to go. So always looking for our forcing moves. This, again, is a forcing move. It is a threat, but in some cases, just a threat, not an actual check, is not always enough. So checks, checks, checks. A lot of students get in their head, it's always good to give a check if you have one. This example will show why that is not always the case. So in the last example, we left our knight hanging because we had, bigger threats over here by giving checks. In this case, again, the knight is also hanging. A lot of beginner students that I've worked with will be tempted by this, long open diagonal and actually give this check with the bishop. But now after black pushes c6, suddenly we have a bishop hanging and we have a knight hanging. And we've only got 1 move to deal with both of these threats, and we're going to lose material here. So that's sort of the second step to this, is when you see a check that you can give, you have to ask yourself, how can my opponent respond to this move? If they can block with a pawn like this, and you already have a piece that's being attacked by a pawn, that's probably not the best move, right? Another example, sometimes you'll give a queen check and they can block with a bishop. So you just always have to look, how can my opponent stop this check, stop the threat, And is that something that is going to throw a wrench in my plans? But this is how you learn to get better at chess, right? You see this check that you can potentially give, and then you try to go one move further, right? Okay, if I give this check, what is my opponent going to do? Okay, they can push this pawn, and then I've got 2 pieces hanging. Okay, I'm discarding this move entirely. I'm not going to think about it anymore. I think a lot of times we attempt to get too creative in our moves because we've seen really nice attacking games by grandmasters, but a lot of times it's better to just play simple chess, just like move the piece. Just move the piece, it's okay, and then we can move on. But going back to examples where we don't necessarily have to respond to our opponent's threat and move the piece, in this case, we have a mate in 4. So this is actually a pretty common pattern. When your knight is up in your opponent's face, they might try and kick it out, but because you have checks or forcing moves, they'll just never have the time to actually take the knight, and the knight will assist with the checkmate. So this is another question I remember having as more of a beginner chess player. So I have a check here, and I have a check here. Which one is best? In this case, it's pretty clear to see, okay, the knight can take, and so if we put our queen there, well, we don't want to just lose the queen for no reason, right? And so we still want to do the forcing move, but if we check with the bishop and the knight takes, now we can give the check with the queen. The king has really nowhere to go. If it goes here, we give the checkmate, and if it goes here, we also give the checkmate. So again, it's going that step further. What will my opponent do in response to my check, in response to my threat? If we give this check and the knight doesn't take, but the king actually moves, a lot of times these are the hardest ones to calculate, the non-forcing sequences. But we can actually just take this pawn, and now we have 2 pieces hanging, but because the queen and the rook are lined up, we actually just have way too many threats for white to deal with all in one move. So if white takes the knight, we actually have checkmate just by going to c2. The bishop cuts off this escape square, and the king can't take because it's protected by the rook. And if white takes our bishop, we again have this check right here. The king moves, and now defended by the knight, we can go right here. White just never had time to take this defending piece, and we were able to win the game. So going back to our very first example, let's look and see if we can find all of the checks in this position. Well, there's only one. A lot of people, when I posted this on Twitter, were suggesting this move, but that's not a forcing move. It's not forcing our opponent to do anything, and in fact, we have to think one step further. What will white do after we take the knight, right? We're threatening checkmate here, but white can just take this pawn. And now we can't move. We actually have to block with the bishop. That's removing one of the very important defenders of this potential checkmate. And then white can just push here, and our entire threat is just neutralized. So we have to consider our opponent's forcing moves too. And so a lot of times in these kinds of positions, in puzzles or in games, you have to consider whether the line that you are calculating has a point where there are no forcing moves on your side, right? And then you have to ask yourself, okay, what's my opponent going to do in the meantime? And if your opponent has a check, then it gets a little iffy. Now going back to the starting position, the only forcing move that we have is actually rook takes g2, which might look completely insane if you've never seen it before. But the point of this pattern, of course, is that after the white king takes, we can now take the knight with check, protected by the bishop, and after the king moves, we have checkmate. But things get a little bit more complicated because after rook takes g2, the king doesn't have to take, which actually happened in the game. The king didn't take this rook, probably recognizing that this pattern was a thing, and actually just moved the king over to h1. So now the question is, how can we continue with this sequence of forcing moves? How can we prevent white from ever getting the chance to grab this pawn and start, being aggressive on this side? Now we've already committed to sacrificing this rook, so it does get a little bit easier to find more rook sacrifices in this position. One example of a recommendation I saw was actually to give this check, which, works great if the rook takes, because we can take and then we have checkmate here. But the problem is the rook doesn't have to take. This is just a free rook, and so the king can actually take, and now we have the thing where we have a space that we don't have a forcing move, because if we give this check, the bishop just comes back and blocks, and now we can take the knight, but now, of course, the checks start over here, and we lose our important attacking piece here. So rook g1 doesn't work because the king can just take. What about this check? So the knight can't take because it's pinned, so if it moves, then the king is in check, and that's just an illegal move. But the bishop can take, and now we can grab the knight with check. That's the very important part, is that we're giving check to the white king, forcing the king to move here, and now we have our mate. And if the king moves over, again, looking for all of our forcing moves, now we can give the check on h1, force the king down here, and now this beautiful queen takes knight, right? protecting through the king, protecting the rook, and white is donezo here. So going all the way back to the beginning of this puzzle, or actually it's just a position that I played, when I sacrifice this rook, it's a pretty thematic sacrifice in this particular opening that I play, which is like a very dubious version of the French. If I was playing this in a longer game, I would have had to calculate out all of those different lines that I just talked about, but in a blitz game, I essentially just had to trust that eventually all of my threats piling up would be enough to win me the game, even though I was going to be down 2 rooks. So that's where doing a lot of puzzles really helps in actual games, because your intuition will just sort of ding 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 start going off and say, okay, I have this check, I think I have enough pieces, let's go for it. Thanks so much for watching, I hope you enjoyed. Please be sure to drop a comment if you have any other ideas for videos that you'd like to see, and I'll see you soon.